It is 4 o'clock in the afternoon on November 30th, 1864, and a one-legged general strapped to his saddle is about to destroy his own army. John Bell Hood sits on horseback atop Locust Grove Hill, 1 mile south of Franklin, Tennessee, watching 20,000 men form into battle lines across 2 miles of open farmland. The fields below are flat, treeless, covered in the stubble of harvested corn, ankle-deep in mud from days of cold rain. There is no cover, no ravines, no ridgeline to hide behind. Just 800 yards of naked ground between his men and the Union breastworks, 5-foot earthworks backed by more than 100 cannons. His officers have begged him not to do this. Nathan Bedford Forrest proposed a flanking march. Patrick Cleburne, the finest division commander in the Confederate Army, warned him the works were too strong. Hood overruled them all. In the next 5 hours, the Army of Tennessee will suffer more casualties than the Confederate forces took during Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, except at Franklin. It will happen not across a single afternoon, but compressed into a fury so intense that 3,000 men will fall in the first 60 minutes alone. Sometime around 6 o'clock, after watching wave after wave of his men shatter against those earthworks, Hood will turn to an aide and say 4 words, "We are finished here." Was this the moment a general realized he had murdered his own army? Or was it something colder, a calculation, not a confession? The answer depends on which version of John Bell Hood you believe. And there is the mystery of Patrick Cleburne, the man they called the Stonewall of the West, a defensive genius who had never lost a position he was ordered to hold. On this afternoon, he will lead a suicidal frontal assault he had argued against the night before. He will not survive it. The question is why he charged at all. All of this, the assault, the slaughter, the collapse of an army, happened because an entire Union force had slipped past Hood's army in the dark the night before. And Hood never forgave it. By the end of this video, you will understand why a broken man on a broken horse ordered the most catastrophic frontal assault of the entire Civil War, and the moment he knew it was over, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most devastating battles, the moments where one man's decision changed everything, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a video. Now let me take you back to Tennessee, November 1864, and show you how it all went wrong. To understand why Hood stood on that hill ready to throw his army into a meat grinder, you have to understand the night before. Hood had been chasing Schofield's Union army south to north across Tennessee for 2 days, covering nearly 25 miles from Pulaski, in a grueling pursuit designed to cut the Federals off before they could reach Nashville. He had believed, genuinely believed, that he could trap Schofield at the little crossroads town of Spring Hill and end the war in the West. Hood was 33 years old, a Kentuckian born in Owingsville, West Point class of 1853, dead last in his graduating class, which is worth noting because the man who finished ahead of him was John Schofield, the very general he was now chasing. Hood had lost the use of his left arm at Gettysburg. His right leg was amputated at Chickamauga. He rode strapped into his saddle, relying on aides to lift him on and off his horse, managing pain with laudanum and morphine. He had married Anna Huth in 1862. A shattered body driven by unbroken ambition. On the evening of November 29th, Hood's army had Schofield in a vice at Spring Hill. Confederate troops were within 500 yards of the Columbia Pike, the only road north to Franklin and Nashville. All Hood had to do was close the trap. But the orders went wrong. They arrived late. Units marched past Union positions in the dark, close enough to hear Federal soldiers talking, and never attacked. Confusion, miscommunication, and the fog of a November night conspired to leave the road open. Schofield's entire army, 30,000 men, wagons, artillery, everything, marched north in the dark, within 50 yards of Confederate pickets at points, and escaped. 18 miles to Franklin. By dawn, they were gone. The man who had seen it coming was Patrick Cleburne, 36 years old, born in County Cork, Ireland, an apprentice druggist who had emigrated to America with nothing and taught himself law in Helena, Arkansas, building a career from the ground up before the war consumed everything. They called him the Stone Wall of the West because he had never lost a position he was ordered to hold. That evening at Spring Hill, Cleburne had gone to Hood and urged a flanking night march. "Cannot we turn Spring Hill tonight and get between Schofield and Nashville?" Hood refused. He wanted a direct attack. When dawn revealed empty roads and campfire ashes where a Union army had been, Hood erupted. He blamed Cheatham. He blamed everyone but himself. And then he mounted his horse and rode north toward Franklin, burning with the kind of fury that gets armies killed. The army Hood dragged toward Franklin that morning was not the army that had fought at Atlanta 6 months earlier. It had been bled, retreated, bled again. Roughly 33,000 men in 3 infantry corps, Benjamin Cheatham's 8,500 on the center, Alexander Stewart's 9,000 on the left, Stephen D. Lee's 9,500 on the right, plus Nathan Bedford Forrest's 5,000 cavalry screening the flanks. They had 54 artillery pieces. They had been marching for 2 days on half rations. Many were barefoot. Most were conscripts and volunteers from Tennessee, Georgia, Arkansas, and Mississippi, farmers, laborers, boys who had signed up in 1861 expecting a short war and were now deep into the 4th year of one that had eaten everything they had. Here is what you need to understand about these men. They had been marching since before dawn. They had covered nearly 25 miles in the last 48 hours. They had not eaten a full meal in days. And now they were being asked to cross 800 yards of open ground, uphill, with no cover, into the mouths of 100 cannons. Many of them knew exactly what that meant. They went anyway. Schofield had not wasted the night. His engineers had turned Franklin into a killing ground. The Union line stretched 2 miles across the southern approach to town, anchored on the Harpeth River to the west, and strong earthworks to the east. Breastworks stood 5 feet high. In front of them, ditches 6 feet deep held ankle-deep standing water. Beyond the ditches, abatis, sharpened logs and tangled branches slowed any approach to a crawl. Behind the works, more than 100 artillery pieces waited, loaded with canister. Schofield had roughly 30,000 men, the 23rd Corps with 8,500, the 4th Corps with 10,500, and cavalry. John Schofield was 33, the same age as Hood, the same West Point class. Except Schofield had finished ahead. Before the war, he had been a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, married with 2 children, a methodical and cautious man who understood fortifications the way Hood understood aggression. His men's morale was high. They had escaped Spring Hill, they had fortifications, and they knew Thomas was waiting at Nashville with reinforcements just 18 miles north. They only needed to hold until dark, then slip away again. Cleburne rode the lines that afternoon and saw what Hood refused to see, the Irish immigrant who had proposed arming enslaved men to fight for the South. An idea so radical it had effectively ended his chances of further promotion, was brilliant, principled, and deeply uncomfortable with what he was being ordered to do. He had argued against a frontal assault at Spring Hill. Hood had ignored him. Now he was being asked to lead one. He had never lost a defensive position. He was about to die leading an attack on one. It was early afternoon when Hood made the decision that would destroy the Army of Tennessee. He sat on horseback on Locust Grove Hill, the town of Franklin spread before him, the Union works clearly visible, his corps commanders gathered. Forrest spoke first. He proposed taking his cavalry and a division of infantry on a wide flanking march east, crossing the Harpeth upstream and hitting Schofield from behind while the main army pinned the front. It was textbook. It was what any officer trained at West Point would recognize as the correct move. Hood said no. The argument that followed was fierce. Forrest pressed. Cleburne, who had urged flanking maneuvers the night before at Spring Hill, likely supported it, but Hood was not thinking about tactics. He was thinking about Spring Hill. about the army that had slipped through his fingers in the dark, about the subordinates he believed had failed him. He later wrote in his 1875 memoir, "I determined to attack Schofield at Franklin, believing the opportunity too favorable to be lost. But the men standing around him heard something different in his voice. This was not calculation. This was rage. He ordered a frontal assault, straight across the open ground, no flanking, no waiting for all his artillery to come up, no waiting for Lee's corps to be fully in position, straight in. Cheatham, who would lead the center, stared at the Union works. A colonel beside him said what everyone was thinking. 'My God, General, do you mean to breastwork that gap?' Cheatham's answer was simple and terrible. 'Go forward. Stop and consider what just happened.' Hood's own cavalry commander, Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the most feared tactical minds of the Civil War, had offered him a way to win without a massacre. Cleburne, the Stonewall of the West, had been urging flanking maneuvers for 24 hours. Hood overruled them both. Not because their plan was flawed, because he was angry. Because Spring Hill had humiliated him, and because the pain in his shattered body and the laudanum dulling his mind had narrowed his world to a single burning impulse: punish the enemy in front of him. The rank and file could read terrain. They looked at those 800 yards of open field and understood. Private Pleasant Woodford, 28, a Mississippi conscript from Adams' brigade, a man from a plantation family who had been conscripted in 1864, who had left his wife and farm and had written letters home begging for peace, looked at the Union works and later wrote that he knew it was butchery before a single shot was fired. But the drums beat assembly, the officers shouted the orders, and 20,000 Confederate soldiers, many of them veterans of Shiloh, Chickamauga, Atlanta, stepped off into formation. It was a few minutes before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was already low. In less than an hour, 6 Confederate generals would be dead or mortally wounded. 54 regimental commanders would be casualties, and the Stonewall of the West would be lying face down at the base of the Union breastworks with 8 bullets in his body. None of them knew it yet. The drums were still beating. The ground between Hood's army and the Union line was the cruelest kind of battlefield, beautiful and completely exposed. 2 miles of flat Tennessee farmland, harvested corn stubble in neat rows, bisected down the center by the Columbia Pike, a muddy, rutted road that ran straight as a rifle barrel toward the Federal works. To the west, the Harpeth River gleamed dull silver in the November light. To the east, low wooded hills offered no cover for advancing infantry. The fields sloped gently upward toward the Union position, a 3% grade, barely noticeable on foot, but enough to slow an exhausted man carrying a rifle and ankle-deep in mud. 800 yards. That was the distance, 8 football fields of flat, coverless terrain with 100 cannons at the far end. In tactical terms, it was a killing field of almost mathematical perfection. At 400 yards, Union riflemen behind breastworks could begin picking off targets. At 200 yards, canister rounds from those 100-plus guns would shred formations. At 100 yards, if anyone made it that far, massed musket volleys would hit at point-blank range. And there was nowhere to hide, no ravine, no fold in the earth, no trees, just mud and stubble and the long walk into the guns. At 4 o'clock, 54 Confederate Napoleon cannons opened from the hills south of town. The sound was enormous, a rolling, concussive thunder that shook the ground and echoed off the Harpeth River bluffs. Across the fields, 100 Union guns answered, and then the Confederate lines stepped forward. 20,000 men, shoulder to shoulder, battle flags snapping in the cold November air. They advanced at a walk, not because they wanted to, but because the mud sucked at their boots, slowing every step to a crawl. Think about what that looked like from the Union works. An entire army walking toward you across an open field. No cover, no feint, no flanking column appearing on your flank. Just a wall of men coming straight at you, as if the commanding general had decided to feed his army into a threshing machine. Union soldiers later said they could not believe what they were seeing. Some thought it was a diversion, that the real attack must be coming from somewhere else. It wasn't. From Locust Grove Hill, a mile behind the advancing lines, Hood watched through field glasses. He could see everything, the long grey lines moving north, the puffs of smoke from the Union works, the first men stumbling and falling at 400 yards. He was strapped into his saddle, his empty right trouser leg pinned up, his useless left arm hanging at his side. He had ordered this. Every man crossing that field was crossing it because of him. The glasses stayed at his eyes. But there was a complication Hood had not anticipated. Between his advancing army and the main Union works, a Union division under General George Wagner had pushed a detached brigade of 2,500 men forward, out in front of the main line, on a slight rise along the Columbia Pike. Wagner was 43, an Ohio man, West Point class of 1846, a Mexican War veteran who prided himself on aggressiveness. He had ordered his forward brigade to hold their position and delay the Confederate advance. It was a sensible order, in theory. In practice, it meant 2,500 Union soldiers were standing in the open with no breastworks, directly in the path of 20,000 oncoming Confederates. They were not a speed bump. They were about to become a catastrophe. The forward Union troops held for perhaps 10 minutes. Then the sheer mass of the Confederate assault overwhelmed them. Wagner's men broke. They turned and ran, not in orderly retreat, but in full panic, sprinting back toward the main Union line with thousands of Confederates on their heels. And here was the disaster. When Wagner's fleeing soldiers hit the main breastworks, they couldn't stop. They poured over the earthworks and into the Union lines, and the Confederates came pouring in right behind them. The defenders couldn't fire without killing their own men. For a few terrible minutes, there was a hole in the Union line. This is the moment the Battle of Franklin nearly ended in a Confederate victory. Not because of Hood's plan. His plan was suicide. But because of a panicked retreat by Union soldiers that accidentally punched a hole in the strongest defensive line in Tennessee. The Confederates who surged through that gap were Cleburne's men and Cheatham's men, the best the Army of Tennessee had. And for about 20 minutes, they were inside the Union works, fighting hand-to-hand among the earthworks and the gun emplacements. And no one on either side knew who was winning. Cleburne's division, the men he had led across 2 years of war, hit the Union breastworks like a wave hitting a seawall. They surged through the gap that Wagner's panicked retreat had created, scrambling over the 5-foot earthworks, bayonets fixed, screaming the rebel yell. For 20 minutes, just 20 minutes, Confederate battle flags flew on the Union side of the works. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the ditches and along the parapets. Muskets were swung as clubs. Men grabbed at each other's throats. This was not a battle anymore. This was a brawl at the mouth of hell. The man who saved the Union line was Emerson Opdyke, a Union brigadier who had held the line at Spring Hill the night before. Without waiting for orders, he threw his reserve brigade directly into the breach. Fresh Union troops slammed into exhausted Confederates who had just crossed 800 yards of open ground under fire. The fighting was point-blank, muskets discharged into faces, bayonets punching through overcoats. The Union line bent, buckled, but held. Within 20 minutes, the breach was sealed. The Confederates who had made it inside were dead, captured, or pushed back over the works. The first assault had failed, and it was only 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun had barely begun to set. The first wave was broken, the ground between the lines carpeted with dead and wounded, and John Bell Hood, watching from his hill, ordered the next wave forward. The first charge was supposed to be the decisive blow. Instead, it was the beginning of 4.5 more hours of slaughter, and the beginning of the end of the Army of Tennessee. The second wave came at 4:30, then the third, then the fourth. Each time the Confederate lines reformed south of the killing ground, closed the gaps left by the dead, and marched forward again across the same 800 yards of mud and corpse-strewn stubble. Each time, the Union guns tore them apart at the same ranges: 400 yards, 200 yards, 100 yards, point blank. Private John McQuirk Copley, 22 years old, a farmer's son from Izard County, Arkansas, was in Cleburne's division. He had volunteered in 1861 at 19 after hearing the news from Bull Run. He had survived Chickamauga with wounds. He had written home praising Hood's aggression. Now he was charging across a field where the dead lay so thick he had to step on them. His diary, recovered after the war, recorded the assault in the blunt language of a man who knew he was probably writing his last words. "The lines are crashing forward, boys falling like wheat, but we must take those works or die." Less time than it takes to cook a meal, 3,000 Confederate soldiers had already fallen. The ground between the starting position and the Union works was no longer a field. It was a carpet of gray and butternut, some of the bodies still moving, most of them not. The battlefield had transformed. Black powder smoke, sulfur, and something worse, something that smelled like burnt hair, rolled across the fields in waves. Captain James Johnston, on Cleburne's staff, wrote in his diary that night by candlelight. The smoke was like Hades' breath. Visibility dropped from 500 yards to 50. The ground shook with each artillery volley. Union General Sturgis later recalled it felt like earthquake. Men fired blind. Men charged blind. Men died without ever seeing the bullet that killed them. And still the drums beat, and still the officers screamed forward, and still the lines reformed and advanced. Copley was bayoneted in the stomach during this phase of the assault, around 5 o'clock. He fell among the dead in front of the works. He did not survive. His diary was recovered from his body. He was 22 years old and had been in the army since he was 19. He had died in a charge ordered by a general who could not walk. The smoke was now so thick that men on both sides were firing into their own ranks. Private Thomas Marcellus of the 5th Tennessee wrote to his sister 3 days later, "The smoke was so thick we fired into our own ranks. I heard Cleburne's last words, 'Forward, men.'" Patrick Cleburne was at the front. He was always at the front. It was the thing that made his men love him and the thing that would kill him. Somewhere around 5 o'clock, as the 4th or 5th wave crashed against the Union breastworks, Cleburne's horse was shot from under him. He continued on foot. A second horse was brought. It was killed. On foot again, he drew his sword and led his men toward the earthworks at a run. Consider the mathematics of what Cleburne was doing. He was a division commander, a major general, leading a charge on foot, sword in hand, across open ground into the massed fire of 100 cannons and 12 Union brigades. Division commanders are supposed to be behind the lines, directing movement. Cleburne was in front of them, running at the guns. He knew what this meant. He was not trying to win anymore. He was trying to show his men that it was possible to reach those works, that a man could get there, that courage was enough. It wasn't. He was scaling the Union breastworks when a bullet struck him in the head. He died instantly. His body tumbled down the face of the earthworks. When it was recovered the next day, the burial detail counted 8 bullet wounds. Whether all 8 came before or after death, no one could say. A post-war pension claim by a Confederate soldier alleged that Cleburne had actually surrendered and been executed. But exhumation and forensic examination in the 2000s confirmed that his wounds were consistent with combat, not execution. He died fighting. The Stonewall of the West, a druggist's apprentice from County Cork who had become the finest division commander in the Confederacy, was dead at 36. He had never lost a defensive position. He died leading an attack. Opdyke's Union counterattack pushed the breach closed again. Union 12-pounder cannons, loaded with canister tin cans packed with iron balls, fired at ranges of 50 yards and less. At that distance, a single canister round was like a giant shotgun blast, cutting a swath through packed infantry formations. The defenders poured 100,000 musket rounds into the advancing waves, roughly 5 rounds for every Confederate who crossed that field. The Confederates kept coming. Dusk came at 4:45, remarkably early as November days die fast in Tennessee. The battlefield, already choked with smoke, now sank into a gray half-light that turned the charging Confederates into shadows and the muzzle flashes into orange blooms against the dark. Zoom in, not on the generals, not on the battle lines, on one man's hands. They are shaking, not from fear, but from the recoil of an Enfield rifle fired so many times the barrel is too hot to touch. His shoulder is bruised black from the kick. His teeth are black from biting open cartridges. He cannot hear. The cannons have stolen that from him. He loads, fires, loads, fires, into smoke so thick he cannot see what he's shooting at. He will do this for 4 more hours. It was during this twilight phase that the battle became something personal for one Confederate soldier. Private Todd Carter was 24 years old, serving in the 20th Tennessee. He was a Franklin native, and the Union breastworks he was charging toward were in his family's yard. The Carter house, his childhood home, was Schofield's command post. His family was sheltering in the basement while the battle raged in their garden, their fields, their doorstep. Carter charged across the ground where he had played as a boy. He was wounded, shot down in his own yard, within sight of the house where he was born. He was carried inside after the battle. His family found him among the wounded. He died in the Carter house the next day. The floors where he bled are still stained. The boy who had marched away to war had come home to die in his mother's parlor. The fifth wave hit the Union works around 5:30. Confederate battle flags reached the breastworks 6 times during the battle, planted on the parapet, shot down, planted again. Each time, Union reserves countercharged and pushed them back. The fighting along the works had become a continuous roar, not individual volleys anymore, but a single unbroken sound that survivors said made it impossible to hear orders, impossible to hear screams, impossible to hear anything at all except the killing. By 6 o'clock it was nearly full dark, and the battle should have been over. Any sane assessment of the tactical situation, 5 assaults repulsed, thousands dead, the Union line intact, would have ended it. But Hood did not order a retreat. The men who were still fighting had been marching for 2 days. They had crossed those 800 yards of open ground under the worst artillery fire in the Western theater. They had watched the Irish lawyer they called the Stonewall of the West die in front of them. And they were still being ordered forward. Pleasant Woodford, the conscript who had called the assault butchery, was wounded in the leg during the 4th wave. He crawled back through the dead. He survived. He would write to his wife 2 days later, "General Hood threw us away like corn shucks. I saw Cleburne fall and knew it was over." The roar of massed volleys faded into sporadic shooting, individual cracks, then silence, then another crack. Between the volleys, the survivors could hear the wounded. Marcellus, the Tennessee private, remembered that bugles pierced the din but mostly silence after each repulse, broken by surgeons' saws. The battlefield had become a landscape of sound, moaning, praying, the wet sound of men trying to crawl through mud, and everywhere the sharp, distinctive rasp of bone saws as surgeons on both sides worked by lantern light. Lee's corps, the 9,500 men on the Confederate right, had joined the assault during the later waves, adding weight but not breakthrough. The Union right flank, held by Sturgis, the same general who had survived the disaster at Breese's Crossroads earlier that year, poured canister into the advancing ranks until, as Sturgis himself recalled in his memoir years later, the gun barrels glowed in the dark. The 6th and final full assault came and broke. Confederate soldiers, those who could still walk, lay down behind the dead and refused to retreat but could not advance. They pressed their bodies against the earth and waited for the killing to stop. Sometime around 6 o'clock, the exact time varies by account, a pause settled over Locust Grove Hill. The smoke drifted. The guns on both sides fell quiet for a moment, and John Bell Hood, still strapped to his horse, still watching through his field glasses from a mile behind the slaughter he had ordered, said 4 words. What follows is one of the most debated moments in Civil War history. Not a tactical decision, not a flanking maneuver. 4 words spoken by a broken man on a broken horse. And what they actually meant: "We are finished here." The words were overheard by staff officers and recorded in the post-war memoir of Major I.G. Shea, published in the 1870s. Hood himself, in his 1875 memoir Advance and Retreat, written in New Orleans 11 years after the battle, while he sold insurance and tried to rebuild a reputation the war had destroyed, denied any moment of despair. He described the pause as tactical, not emotional. He claimed he was assessing conditions for the next day's march to Nashville. But the men around him told a different story. They described a man staring through field glasses at a field of dead, his face gray, his voice flat, not shouting, not commanding, just stating a fact. "We are finished here." It was not a tactical assessment. It was the sound of a man realizing what he had done. At 9 o'clock, Forrest rode to Hood and urged him to pull back, to reform south and save what was left of the army. Hood refused. He cited morale. He said retreat would destroy what remained of the army's fighting spirit. The surviving Confederates bivouacked on the field, among their dead, and waited for morning. And then, at 11 o'clock, Schofield did exactly what he had done the night before at Spring Hill. He pulled his entire army out of the fortifications, marched them north in the dark, and headed for Nashville, 18 miles away. By dawn, the Union works at Franklin were empty. The field belonged to Hood. 20,000 Confederate soldiers had charged across it. 7,000 of them would never charge anything again. Dawn on December 1st revealed the scope of the disaster. Confederate burial details walked the field south of the Union works and found the dead in rows, not scattered, but in lines, as if they had been mowed down in formation, which is exactly what had happened. The final count was staggering. Confederate casualties totaled more than 7,000 men, 6,300 killed and wounded, another 1,000 captured. Cleburne's division alone lost 40% of its strength, 4 out of every 10 men. 6 Confederate generals were dead or mortally wounded: Cleburne, States Rights Gist, Hiram Granbury, John Adams, Otho Strahl, and John C. Carter. 54 regimental commanders were among the casualties, the men who actually led the charges, gone in a single afternoon. The Army of Tennessee had lost more officers in 5 hours at Franklin than in any other single battle of the war. Union casualties were 2,326, 189 killed, 1,033 wounded, 1,104 missing or captured. The ratio was 3-1, the mathematics of attacking fortified positions. They found Cleburne the next morning, face down at the base of the Union earthworks, his sword still in his hand. 8 bullet wounds. His boots had been stolen during the night, not by the enemy, but by his own men whose shoes had worn through on the march from Pulaski. The finest division commander in the West, the Irish immigrant who had proposed arming slaves to save the Confederacy, the man who had begged Hood to flank instead of charge, lay in the mud with bare feet and a face full of Tennessee dirt. Was Hood's "We are finished here" a confession or a calculation? The honest answer is that we don't know. Hood's own account and the accounts of his staff diverge completely. What we do know is what happened next. Hood did not retreat. He advanced. He marched the remnants of his army 18 miles north to Nashville, where 2 weeks later George Thomas destroyed them completely. Whatever Hood meant by finished, the Army of Tennessee certainly was. 2 days after the battle, from a hospital bed, Woodford, who had called the assault butchery before it began, who had been wounded crawling back through the dead, wrote to his wife, "General Hood threw us away like corn shucks. I saw Cleburne fall and knew it was over." Woodford survived. He limped home to Mississippi after the war and farmed until the 1890s. He never spoke of Franklin again, except in that single letter. At the Carter House, Schofield's former command post, the childhood home of the boy who came home to die, civilian nurse Margaret Pittner worked through the night and into the next day. The parlor was a surgery. Blood-soaked parlor rugs, she wrote. Boys died calling mothers. The Carter family had sheltered in the basement during the battle. When they emerged, they found their son Todd among the wounded, shot down in his own yard. He died in the house the next day. He was 24. The Carter house still stands. The bullet holes are still in the walls. The bloodstains are still on the floors. It is one of the most visited Civil War sites in Tennessee. 8,000 visitors a year walk through the rooms where a boy came home to die. And Schofield was gone. Just as he had slipped away from Spring Hill in the dark, he slipped away from Franklin, the professor who outran the warrior. 30,000 men, their artillery, their wagons, marching north on the Nashville pike, while Hood's shattered army lay on the field. He reached Nashville by December 1st and linked up with Thomas. The escape Hood had spent 2 days trying to prevent had happened anyway. The assault that was supposed to destroy Schofield before he reached Nashville had instead destroyed the army meant to catch him. The mathematics of the campaign had inverted completely. Union Captain Lyman Kidder, writing in his diary that night at the Carter House, recorded what the Confederate prisoners were saying. Prisoners came in cursing Hood. One said, "He sent us to hell on purpose." Whether Hood intended it or not, that was how his own men understood what had happened to them. They had been thrown across 800 yards of open ground into fortified positions because their commanding general was angry about the night before. They knew it, and they would never forgive it. The dead were buried in shallow trenches December 1st and 2nd. Roughly 2,000 Confederate soldiers were interred in what would become McGavock Cemetery, only 702 of them identified by name. The rest were listed by state regiment or simply as unknown. The Union dead were buried separately. News of the disaster reached Washington by telegraph on December 2nd. The reports were blunt. In 5 hours of fighting, the Confederacy had lost more men at Franklin than the Union lost in the entire Battle of Gettysburg's Pickett's Charge. It was the most catastrophic frontal assault of the Civil War, and it had been ordered by a man who could not walk. But the battle's end was just the beginning of what Franklin would mean. For the war, for Hood, and for the way America remembers its most terrible afternoon. 2 weeks after Franklin, Hood marched his broken army to Nashville. He had 23,000 men left, down from the 33,000 he had marched across Tennessee. On December 15th and 16th, George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, the methodical, patient general who was everything Hood was not, attacked. The Battle of Nashville was the most complete Union victory of the war. The Army of Tennessee was destroyed as a fighting force. Hood's casualties at Nashville were another 3,000. Half the army that had survived Franklin simply ceased to exist as a coherent force. The army that had terrified the Union in 1862 and 1863 was gone. Hood was relieved of command on January 17, 1865. In his 1875 memoir, Advance and Retreat, Hood wrote the words that would define the debate around Franklin for the next century and a half. Franklin was a mistake. I should have flanked. But opportunity seemed golden. It is the closest he ever came to admitting what his own soldiers had known since that afternoon, that the assault was driven by emotion, not strategy. But even in confession, Hood hedged. He blamed Cheatham for poor execution. He blamed his subordinates for Spring Hill. He never fully owned what happened in those 5 hours, and the 7,000 who fell in 5 hours never got a straight answer from the man who sent them across that field. Hood moved to New Orleans after the war. He sold insurance. He married Anna. They had 5 children between 1867 and 1873. He was 48 years old when yellow fever swept New Orleans in the summer of 1879. Hood died on August 30th. His wife died the same day. Their eldest daughter died the next. The orphaned Hood children, 5 of them, the youngest still an infant, were scattered among relatives across the South. The man who had destroyed an army could not protect his own family. Here is what most people get wrong about Franklin. The popular image of Hood is brave but stupid, a reckless cripple who ordered a suicidal charge out of sheer incompetence. But in 2012, a trove of private Hood papers, personal letters, campaign maps, detailed planning documents, was discovered and published. They revealed a Hood who was more strategic than history remembered. His plans for the Tennessee campaign were detailed and rational. The problem was not that Hood couldn't think. The problem was that at Franklin, on November 30th, 1864, he stopped thinking and started feeling. The rage over Spring Hill, the pain in his body, the laudanum, they all converged on a single afternoon, and 7,000 men paid the price. Go back to that hill. Locust Grove, 4 o'clock, November 30th. A one-legged general strapped to his horse, watching 20,000 men walk into the guns. He had lost his arm at Gettysburg. He had lost his leg at Chickamauga. And at Franklin, he lost everything else, his army, his reputation, and the war in the West. We are finished here. 4 words. Whether they were a confession of despair or a cold tactical assessment, the result was the same. The Army of Tennessee was finished. The Confederacy's last chance in the West was finished, and John Bell Hood, the broken man on the broken horse, knew it. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold stories from history's most devastating battles. I'll see you in the next one.